Welcome to another episode of real-life haunted stories. If you love chilling tales and spine-tingling horror stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a scare. New nightmares drop every week. Stay haunted. So, let's start our today's episode. Story 1. The Nameless Cemetery. The town of Eldridge had long been forgotten by the world. Nestled between mountains and hidden by dense forests, it had never appeared on any map, yet it was home to a dark and foreboding secret, the Nameless Cemetery. Old folks whispered about it, but most of the townspeople avoided the area altogether. It wasn't that the graveyard was particularly large or ancient. It was the history that surrounded it, the things that were buried there, things that had been lost to time. Julia Mallory, a historian driven by an insatiable curiosity, arrived in Eldridge with one purpose: to uncover the truth behind the cemetery. She had heard rumors of strange rituals, forgotten cults, and dark, unspoken events tied to the place. A curious woman, her academic mind dismissed the superstitions as mere folklore, but her instincts told her that something was wrong. Something far darker was waiting to be discovered. Julia's first impression of Eldridge was that it was a town stuck in time, trapped in an era long past. The streets were narrow, the buildings quaint but weathered, and the people seemed wary, almost too wary for a place so isolated. She made her way to the inn, where the innkeeper, Mrs. Alder, eyed her suspiciously. "You'll want to be careful," Mrs. Alder warned, her voice low. "Not many come around here for good reasons, especially to visit the cemetery." Julia smiled politely, dismissing the woman's warnings. She had encountered this kind of skepticism before in her research. It was common for small towns to hold tight to their secrets, to fear what they didn't understand. But Julia wasn't afraid. She had dealt with death and history in her academic career, and she knew how to navigate ancient records. She retired to her room and spent the evening going over what little information she had on the cemetery. The maps were incomplete. The records seemed almost deliberately vague. No one could seem to pinpoint when or why the cemetery had been abandoned. The town's oldest residents were the only ones who spoke of it, but even they did so in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid someone might be listening. The next day, Julia ventured into the town's archives. The building was dusty and neglected, and the librarian, a frail old woman named Miss Barnes, was little help. She muttered about the cemetery being cursed and advised Julia to leave it alone. But Julia was undeterred. She scoured through decades-old records, finding more questions than answers. The cemetery was listed in early town documents, but it seemed to have been forgotten sometime around the mid-1800s. A gap in the records from that time period only fueled Julia's curiosity. She knew that something had happened, a dark event that caused the cemetery to be abandoned, something that had been buried in time. In one of the old, crumbling records, Julia discovered the first clue: references to an old cult that had lived in Eldridge in the early 1800s. The cult was said to have practiced strange rites, and their leader was rumored to be a man named Elias Volker. A series of symbols appeared in the records, all linked to the cemetery, but none of them made sense to Julia. Yet something about them felt familiar, like she had seen them before. That afternoon, Julia made her way to the cemetery. The path leading to it was overgrown, barely visible beneath the dense foliage. The graveyard itself was surrounded by an iron fence, rusted and twisted. As she stepped inside, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of earth and decay. The graves were ancient, some so worn that their inscriptions were illegible. Others, however, still carried strange markings, symbols of some long-lost faith. Julia wandered deeper into the cemetery, her footsteps muffled by the thick grass. She felt watched, as though unseen eyes were following her every move. The feeling grew stronger with each step, but she pressed on, determined to uncover whatever lay hidden here. At the farthest corner of the cemetery, she found the first unusual thing, an unmarked grave. It was completely different from the others, newer, fresher, as though someone had recently disturbed the earth. The ground around it had been freshly dug, but the grave itself was filled with a large stone slab. Something about it felt wrong. That night, Julia's sleep was plagued by nightmares. Shadows danced just beyond the edge of her vision. She heard whispers, fragmented words that didn't make sense. Leave. Now. The ritual. It's not finished. She awoke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. The next morning, Julia's research took a darker turn. She stumbled upon a diary, one that had been hidden in the town's archives. It belonged to someone named Annabelle Volker, the daughter of the cult's leader. The diary chronicled the final days of the cult's existence, its descent into madness, and their unholy experiments with the dead. Annabelle's final entry was chilling. We have opened the gates. The dead walk with us now. Father says it is too late to turn back. Julia's blood ran cold. The references to rituals, to the dead walking, were all tied to the cemetery. Annabelle had written that her father had completed the ritual that would bind the souls of the dead to the cemetery. But something had gone horribly wrong. The souls, trapped between worlds, had become restless, vengeful, determined to stop whatever dark force lingered in the cemetery. Julia returned the next day to investigate further. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The cemetery seemed alive with a malignant energy, as if the spirits of the dead were awakening. As she approached the unmarked grave, the ground began to shift. Something large and heavy was moving beneath her feet. Suddenly, the earth split open, revealing a deep black void. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man in tattered old clothing, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. His name was Elias Volker. "Welcome, Julia Mallory," he whispered. "We've been waiting for you." The air around her grew colder. The whispers became louder, more insistent. The dead were speaking to her, beckoning her to join them. Elias stepped forward, his form flickering between life and death, a ghostly figure bound to the cemetery for eternity. "You've come to finish what your ancestors started," he said, his voice a rasping whisper. "The ritual is incomplete. You are the final piece." Elias led Julia to the heart of the cemetery, where the symbols she had found in the records were carved into the earth. The air pulsed with an unnatural energy, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. The spirits of the dead, once mere whispers, now loomed in the shadows, their faces twisted in agony. Julia's mind raced. She realized that the ritual could only be completed with her blood. Her life force would fuel the opening of the gate between the living and the dead. But if she gave in, she would become one of them, trapped forever in the cursed cemetery. With a surge of strength, Julia broke free from Elias's grip and began to chant the incantation she had found in Annabelle's diary. The cemetery trembled, the ground cracking open as the spirits screamed in rage. The ritual was stopped, but at a terrible cost. The cemetery seemed to collapse in on itself, the ground swallowing everything. Elias Volker and the spirits were dragged back into the abyss from which they had emerged, their vengeful cries echoing into the night. Julia stood alone, the air thick with silence. She had broken the curse, but she knew that the cemetery would never be truly gone. The dead, no matter how bound, would always seek a way to return. As Julia left Eldridge, the fog seemed to part, and the sun finally broke through the clouds. But as she walked away, a whisper carried on the wind. "We'll be waiting, Julia. We'll be waiting." Story 2. The Whispering Graves. The village of Black Hollow had always been a quiet place, hidden deep within a valley and surrounded by dense forests. It existed far from the bustling world. For centuries, the villagers had lived simple lives, cultivating the land and respecting the old traditions. But there was one place in Black Hollow that no one spoke of, the ancient graveyard at the edge of the village. The cemetery, known simply as the Whispering Graves, was surrounded by legends of voices in the wind, restless spirits, and an unholy pact made long ago. Local children dared each other to go near the cemetery, but no one ever ventured too far into its overgrown, crumbling depths. To the villagers, the graveyard was a place of power, a place to avoid. But when a young man named Thomas Marks arrived in Black Hollow to take up a position as the new schoolmaster, he had no idea what he was about to uncover. Eager to make his mark on the sleepy village, Thomas found himself drawn to the cemetery. The stories of the Whispering Graves intrigued him, and soon he was obsessed with uncovering the truth. Thomas was an outsider in Black Hollow, but the villagers were polite enough, if a little distant. Most of his days were spent teaching the children in the village school, but his nights were restless, filled with curiosity about the cemetery at the edge of the village. The village elders spoke little of it, and when they did, their words were always cryptic, tinged with fear. The first time Thomas set foot in the cemetery, it felt strange. The air was colder, and the trees surrounding the grave seemed to bend inward, as if trying to keep the place hidden from the rest of the world. The tombstones were old, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, but there were a few newer ones that caught his attention. Their inscriptions were peculiar, names etched in unfamiliar archaic script, and in the center of the graveyard, a large moss-covered mausoleum stood like a dark sentinel, its door slightly ajar. As Thomas wandered deeper into the cemetery, he began to hear it, the whispering. It wasn't loud, nor was it clear. It was a soft murmur, like voices carried on the wind just beyond the edge of his hearing. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the whispers grew louder with each step he took toward the mausoleum. Suddenly, he felt a chill run through his body, as though the air had thickened, suffocating him. A sense of dread overtook him, but his curiosity kept him moving. He approached the mausoleum and pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the stone walls were covered in ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. At the center of the room lay a stone altar stained dark with age. It was then that Thomas saw the grave, the unmarked grave that stood in the corner farthest from the altar. The earth around it was freshly disturbed, as though someone or something had recently dug it up. The whispers intensified, and in the flickering candlelight, he thought he saw something move, an ethereal figure standing at the edge of the grave. His heart raced as the figure turned to face him, its hollow eyes burning with a strange, unnatural light. "Leave," the figure whispered. "You don't belong here." The next day, Thomas could not shake the feeling of dread that clung to him after his visit to the cemetery. The whispers haunted him, and the strange figure he had seen in the mausoleum seemed to linger in his mind. He couldn't focus on his work, and the villagers began to notice. One of the older villagers, a woman named Agnes, stopped by the school one afternoon, her face drawn with worry. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said, her voice trembling. "The graveyard has a curse. It has always been there, long before our time. The graves, they don't rest easily, and neither do the dead." Thomas was skeptical at first, dismissing Agnes's words as superstition. But that night, when he returned to his small cottage, he found something that made him reconsider. The door was ajar, though he was certain he had locked it before leaving. Inside, everything seemed normal, except for a small, folded note on the table. It was written in the same strange script as the inscriptions on the graves. Thomas couldn't read it, but the symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. A shiver ran down his spine. It was clear that someone, or something, was watching him. He could feel its presence in the room, pressing down on him like a weight. And then, in the silence, he heard it, the whispering. It was coming from inside his own home. "Come," the voice whispered. "Come to us." Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Thomas began to delve deeper into the history of Black Hollow and the cemetery. His research led him to an old journal hidden in the town's library. It belonged to a man named Samuel Winters, a former resident of Black Hollow who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances more than a century ago. The journal contained strange, rambling accounts of rituals performed in the cemetery, of a pact made with an ancient, malevolent entity that lurked beneath the earth. Samuel had written that the cemetery was no ordinary burial ground. It was the site of an ancient ritual that had bound the spirits of the dead to the land itself. The whispers were the voices of those who had been sacrificed to keep the entity sealed in the earth, an entity that fed on the souls of the dead, feeding off their pain and suffering. As Thomas read further, he discovered that the villagers had once been part of a cult that had made the pact with the entity. The graveyard had been their altar, and the people who had been buried there were the ones chosen to maintain the seal. But over time, the rituals had stopped, the graves had been forgotten, and the entity began to stir once more. Thomas knew he had to act fast. The entity was waking, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. He went to the cemetery once more, determined to confront whatever force was lurking beneath the ground. As he stood before the mausoleum, the earth beneath him began to tremble. The air grew thick with a sense of impending doom, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. He stepped forward, the whispers urging him to turn back, but he ignored them. Inside the mausoleum, the stone altar was now cracked, and the unmarked grave had been unearthed. The ground bubbled and shifted as though something was trying to break free from within. And then, from the depths of the grave, a figure rose, tall, dark, and shadowed, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. The entity had awoken. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a low growl that seemed to reverberate through the very air. Thomas was paralyzed with fear, but he knew that he had no choice but to finish what had been started. The ritual had to be completed, but this time it had to be broken. With everything he had learned from Samuel's journal, he began the incantation that would undo the ancient pact. The earth trembled beneath him as the entity roared in fury, trying to stop him. In the final moments, just as the ritual reached its peak, the graveyard began to collapse. The earth split open, and the entity was pulled back into the depths, its cries fading into silence. The cemetery, once a place of torment, was finally at peace. The next morning, Thomas awoke to find the village changed. The air was clearer, lighter, and the whispering that had plagued him for so long was gone. The cemetery was still there, but it no longer held the same dark power. The spirits had been freed, and the entity was no more. However, as Thomas prepared to leave Black Hollow, he found something strange in the village church. A single gravestone that hadn't been there before. The name etched on it was his own. It seemed that some debts, no matter how old, never truly disappeared. Story 3. The Mourning Oak. There was a place in the sleepy town of Glenwood that no one ever talked about, at least not in the open. Tucked away in the farthest corner of the town cemetery stood an ancient oak tree, twisted and gnarled, with bark as black as pitch and roots that seemed to stretch far deeper into the earth than any tree had a right to. The townsfolk called it the Mourning Oak, and it was said to bear witness to the darkest tragedies that had befallen Glenwood over the centuries. Legend had it that anyone who stood beneath its boughs could hear the mournful whispers of those long dead. Some claimed to have seen figures standing in its shadows, weeping for reasons unknown. Others whispered that the tree had been planted over the grave of a woman who had died under suspicious circumstances, her death never fully explained. It was said that her restless spirit had cursed the oak, and with every passing year the curse grew stronger. But for Rachel Cooper, a young woman who had recently moved to Glenwood, the Mourning Oak was nothing more than a strange curiosity. Rachel, a journalist with a keen interest in the supernatural, had come to the town to escape the city's chaos and find peace in the simplicity of small-town life. But when she heard about the oak tree and the stories surrounding it, her curiosity got the better of her. What she didn't realize was that some stories are not meant to be uncovered, and some places should remain untouched. The Mourning Oak was more than just a tree. It was a doorway to something far more ancient and malevolent. Rachel had been in Glenwood for only a few weeks when she first heard the whispers about the Mourning Oak. It started with passing comments from the locals. The old man at the general store had muttered something about it when she asked for directions to the cemetery. Mrs. Tuttle, the librarian, had seemed unusually nervous when Rachel mentioned the tree while asking for books on local legends. Everyone had a story, but no one would say much more than that. Curiosity piqued, Rachel decided to visit the cemetery one afternoon. It was a peaceful place, the air thick with the scent of old stone and earth. The gravestones were ancient, worn by time, and the few remaining flowers clinging to life seemed to speak of forgotten grief. But the Mourning Oak stood out like a sore thumb, looming dark and foreboding in the corner of the cemetery. It felt wrong, as if the earth itself recoiled from its presence. Rachel stood before it, the weight of the place pressing down on her. The wind was still, and yet she could hear a faint sound, a soft, distant wail like the wind itself mourning. She shook her head, chalking it up to imagination. Yet, the longer she stood there, the stronger the sensation grew. Something wasn't right. Before she could turn to leave, a voice, a woman's voice, whispered from behind her, "Don't go." Rachel spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. Just the silent cemetery and the towering oak. That night, Rachel couldn't shake this strange feeling the mourning oak had given her. Her dreams were filled with shadows, figures moving just beyond her sight. They were always just out of reach, whispering, calling her name. And in the distance, there was always the sound of a woman weeping. The following day, she returned to the cemetery, this time determined to find out the truth. She combed through the old records at the town hall and in the library, learning about the cemetery's history. The mourning oak had been planted a century ago by the town's first settlers. But what intrigued her was the story of a woman named Eleanor Graves, whose grave lay beneath the oak. Eleanor had been the daughter of a prominent family in Glenwood, and according to the stories, her death had been shrouded in mystery. Some claimed it was a tragic accident, while others whispered of a dark secret, an affair, a betrayal, and a murder covered up by the town's most influential families. What was known for certain was that Eleanor's spirit never rested. The oak, they said, had been planted atop her grave to seal her spirit in place. But the town's residents spoke of strange occurrences, cattle dying, crops failing, and shadows moving through the streets at night. The mourning oak was said to hold her spirit captive, and as long as the tree stood, Glenwood would remain under its curse. Rachel felt drawn to Eleanor's story, but as she dug deeper, she began to experience things she couldn't explain. She started hearing whispers, not just in the cemetery, but in her own home. At night, she would wake to find the air heavy, as though something was watching her. The whispers grew louder, until one night she was sure she heard Eleanor's voice, calling out to her, pleading for help. The next morning, Rachel returned to the cemetery, this time with a plan. She would find out what had really happened to Eleanor Graves. She stood before the mourning oak, its twisted branches seeming to reach out toward her like skeletal hands. There was a coldness to the air, a sharp chill that didn't belong. As Rachel stood by the tree, she noticed something strange. The ground at its base was freshly disturbed, as if someone had recently dug beneath it. With trembling hands, she began to dig, the soil crumbling under her fingers. The deeper she went, the colder the earth became, until her hands were numb from the chill. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she uncovered something. A small, ornate box, bound with iron. The whispers around her grew louder, as if the very earth was crying out. Rachel opened the box, her hands shaking. Inside was a letter written in Eleanor's hand, and a small, blood-stained locket. The letter read, "They promised me peace, but they lied. They promised to bury me beneath the oak, to keep me bound here forever, but they never told me the truth. They killed me, and now they will never escape. The curse is not mine alone. It is theirs as well." Suddenly, Rachel was not alone. The shadows around her seemed to shift and writhe, coalescing into a figure, a woman in white, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. "Help me," the figure whispered. "Free me." Rachel's heart raced as the ghostly figure of Eleanor Graves stepped closer. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble with the weight of ancient power. Eleanor's voice echoed in Rachel's mind, urging her to finish what had been started so long ago. The mourning oak, the letter, the locket. They were all part of a curse that had bound Eleanor's spirit to the tree. But there was more. Eleanor's death had not been an accident. The people of Glenwood had killed her, and they had sealed her fate within the tree. And now the curse would claim them all. Rachel had to make a choice: free Eleanor, but in doing so, risk unleashing the wrath of the curse on Glenwood, or leave the town to suffer under the shadow of the mourning oak, knowing that the curse would continue to linger, feeding on the souls of the living. As the moon rose high above the cemetery, Rachel made her decision. With a final, desperate prayer, she took the locket and placed it on the roots of the tree, whispering the incantation she had uncovered in the letter. The ground shook violently, and for a moment, the world went dark. When Rachel opened her eyes, the tree was gone. In its place, there was only the earth, quiet and still. But as she turned to leave, she heard one last whisper, a soft, grateful sigh carried on the wind. And for the first time since she had arrived in Glenwood, the air was silent. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, to show your support, comment to share your thoughts or ask questions, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload.